Thank you very much, Bonnie. And good morning to all of you. I'm assuming it's morning, although occasionally for these things, we get people who are overseas, where you have to say good evening. I was telling Bonnie that given the wonders of modern technology, last night at 10 p.m. Eastern, I'm in Rhode Island, I began a lecture to a group in Thailand. Had to start it at 10 o'clock last night because it was 9 a.m. Friday morning there. And, modern life, that's the way it goes. Okay, so um, most of you, maybe all of you, are clinicians. And as clinicians, you have probably heard the phrase somewhere, when there's an elephant in the room, acknowledge it, right? You're providing psychotherapy, counseling to individuals and couples and families. And some of your clients are thinking about stuff, but they're not talking about it. They're keeping it to themselves, but it's clinically relevant. And that aphorism, when there's an elephant in the room, um, acknowledge it. So here's the elephant in the room for me when I present these sorts of continuing education webinars. That some people log into these things with, let's say, wild enthusiasm. This topic is so interesting, and I'm really curious to know what this guy from Rhode Island has to say about all this. Group one. Group two. I need my CEUs, and I need CEUs on ethics. And I don't care what the topic is. I don't care who the speaker is, as long as that word ethics is in there and I get credit for it, I'm in. Anybody here today for that reason? You don't have to. You don't have to say. But I get it. I get it. People enroll in these things with varying degrees of enthusiasm. And some of you might be thinking, artificial intelligence. You know, I'm not going to use any of this stuff. It's not what I signed up for. I became a practitioner because I want to sit with clients. I want to get to know them. I don't want all this high tech stuff, including AI. But I'll hear what this guy has to say. This is my prediction. When we log off today, in roughly 3 hours, and I get it, sitting in front of a screen yet again to hear somebody talk about ethics and risk management and artificial intelligence may not seem like an exciting, fun thing to do. I get it. My prediction, when we log off today in roughly 3 hours, I hope you will conclude A, this stuff is really complicated. B, none of this was addressed in your formal education unless you graduated about 6 minutes ago. Anybody here graduate 6 minutes ago? And even if, even if you are completely skeptical about incorporating artificial intelligence into the work you do, like, okay, that was kind of interesting, but I'm not doing it. If you're a clinician, my opinion, March 2026, and feel free to agree with me, feel free to disagree, that's fine. My opinion, based on my experience, every clinical practitioner, A, needs to know this stuff, and B, needs to address some of these issues with their clients, even if you do not plan to use it. I'll give you the headline now, details to follow. Some of you who provide clinical services have clients who experience crises outside of normal working hours, right? It's 2:37 a.m. Your client just ended a long-term relationship. They're in deep crisis and they're having suicidal thoughts. You're not available at 2:37 a.m. I'm guessing you're not available at 2:37 a.m. Just a wild guess. I know for a fact, I know for a fact that some practitioners' clients are accessing artificial intelligence platforms at 2:37 a.m., so to speak, to get help, to get support, crisis intervention, suggestions, resources. It is happening. Are the majority of clients doing this? Probably not. Are some of them doing it? You bet. And I know this for a fact. And my prediction is that percentage will increase steadily over time. And therefore, and I'm just going to give you the headline now, details to follow. My opinion is that every clinician needs to bring this up in their consent to treat protocol. So I'm guessing you folks have consent to treat protocols, right? That usual multi-page document that goes over everything about the services you provide and confidentiality exceptions and what to do in the event of an emergency and cancellations, right? I'm guessing all of you use one of those things. And you either hand people pieces of paper or it's on a screen. And they have to acknowledge that they've read it, understand it, all that. I'm going to make a pretty bold statement. I would say everybody needs to revise that document to include some of the content I'm going to talk about today so that clients are informed that this, if they use AI, if they're thinking about using AI to get help when you're not available, this is something you ought to talk about in terms of the potential benefits. And I think there are some potential benefits and the potential risks. And I think there are lots of risks, which I will talk about. And there's emerging empirical evidence that there are risks. Again, details to follow. So I don't want to bore you with biographical detail, but I do need to say a little bit about like what I do. So we have the right context here. So bear with me. As Bonnie said, I'm in Rhode Island. Been on the faculty in the Graduate School of Social Work here at Rhode Island College since 1983. Not 1883. Some people think 1883, 1983, but that's still a long time. And my academic work and my professional work have focused primarily on two things. One is I became a social worker, all those years ago, in order to work in prisons. It's always been my passion. I've worked in federal and state prisons for 27 years. In fact, when I was working with an inmate in a federal prison in Illinois many, many years ago, that's when the light bulb went on in my head that there are complex ethical issues in social work, what we now call behavioral health. When I was working with an inmate who was not real healthy psychiatrically, had a protracted dispute with another inmate, shared with me his hostile thoughts about the other inmate, and I thought he might attack the other inmate, which occasionally happens in prisons. And I had to make a really difficult decision about whether to respect my client's confidentiality or disclose without consent to protect a third party from harm. And all of you will recognize that issue, and you may have learned in school about Tarasoff. Tarasoff, by the way, contrary to what a lot of people think, is not the law of the land. It was never the law of the land. It was law in California. And the legislature actually overrode some of the provisions in the Tarasoff decision, but that's a different story. And that's what led me down the ethics rabbit hole when I struggled with what was then, for me, a very difficult ethical decision. My other focus is professional ethics. And as Bonnie said, I chaired, and it was a great privilege to have chaired the national task force that wrote the code of ethics for the social work profession. So I'm guessing most of you are social workers, and you know about the NASW code of ethics. Some of you practice in states where it is referenced in the law. You're obligated to adhere to that code of ethics. And even if it's not referenced in your law, in courtrooms, that's what the lawyers draw on when they're assessing whether a practitioner did or didn't comply with prevailing ethical standards. It took 2 years of my professional life to draft that code. We've updated it modestly, primarily to address issues related to technology, right? So some of you are providing services remotely. When I drafted the code in the mid-1990s, that's when the current code, most of it was drafted. When I drafted it, along with my colleagues in the mid-1990s, there was no such thing as remote counseling. We couldn't have had a webinar like this using Zoom because that stuff didn't exist. Right? But now we know that practitioners, some of them, are providing services remotely, communicating with their clients using text messaging, or what most of the world calls SMS. We're unique in the US, we call it text messaging in most of the world, and I've had the opportunity to talk about these sorts of issues in Taiwan, and in Korea, and in China, and in India, and in Singapore, and Japan multiple times. I mean, I get around and they call it SMS in most countries, short message service. Some of you have communicated with clients online using social networking sites. Some of you are storing your records in the cloud, right? So in the mid 1990s, none of that stuff existed, but of course it does now. And that's a prelude to what I'm going to talk about today. When some of you started your careers, those of you of a certain age, when you started your careers, the cloud was the white, fluffy thing in the sky, full stop. There was no such thing as an electronic record that you stored in the cloud. And P.S., I'm going to talk about clinical records stored in the cloud, records that were generated by artificial intelligence. It is happening, and it's happening more and more frequently. But hit the pause button on that. When many of you started your careers, TikTok was the sound the clock made on the wall, full stop, not a smartphone app, which, by the way, has been introduced as evidence in some litigation and licensing board cases involving behavioral health practitioners who unfortunately posted content related to their clients on TikTok. No kidding. That wasn't possible when many of us started our careers. I imagine that when many of you started your careers, a tweet was the sound a bird made. Full stop. Not something associated with a smartphone app that used to be called Twitter, now called X. And when many of you started your careers, you may have used the word artificial, as in, thanks for the coffee. Anybody got any sweet and low around here? Like artificial sweetener? And you may have used the word intelligence, because that's a good quality to have as a behavioral health practitioner. But I bet none of you early in your careers put those two words together contiguously in a sentence: artificial intelligence. But here we are. Here we are. And that is a humble reminder to me that while professional ethics instruction can be pretty dry and dusty, there are those issues we go over again and again and again, like don't have sex with your client. Any discussion? Don't falsify your clinical notes. Any discussion? Don't bill for services you never provided. Any discussion? That's the easy stuff. Those issues have been around forever. They'll probably be around forever. And the reality is, again, this is related to what I'm going to talk about later. I spend an enormous percentage of my time, including this morning before we logged on, consulting on legal cases around the United States, occasionally abroad, but mostly the US, where, in the context of lawsuits alleging that behavioral health practitioners were negligent in the way they handled suicide risk assessment, disclosure of confidential information without client consent, the way they managed boundary issues in dual relationships and conflicts of interest, the way they handled termination of services to a client who wasn't paying the bill or was not compliant with the treatment plan. I mean, I see all this stuff. A lot of these cases, whether it's litigation or a licensing board case, and I get involved in a lot of those cases involve evidence. And now the evidence that I'm beginning to see includes artificial intelligence. And I'd never seen that until about 2 years ago. So while some ethical issues have been around forever, will be around forever, there are new things that emerge that require continuing ed. And thank you to Bonnie and her colleagues for making this opportunity available, because that's what continuing ed is for, to keep up with new stuff, not just same old, same old, same old. Okay, so enough about that. I am going to, you know how these things go. If you have a webinar, you got to have a PowerPoint. So in a moment, you should see a PowerPoint. Should be up on the screen like right about now. Okay. All right. So here we go. Mental health professionals' use of artificial intelligence, ethical and risk management challenges. Anybody old enough to remember that? Right? Some of you are. Handset has a cord attached to it. Rotary phone. May it rest in peace. Technology changes. Any of you old enough to remember that typewriter? You can't plug that thing in, right? May it rest in peace. We're talking like Smithsonian exhibit. I remember sitting in front of this key punch machine for hours and hours and hours when I was working on my PhD dissertation at the University of Chicago many years ago, and I had to enter my data on that machine using these IBM cards, and I had to schlep boxes of these things across campus to the computer center so that these cards could be entered into a card reader and I could analyze my data using SPSS. And we thought that was fast. Oh my goodness, what a dinosaur. May it all rest in peace. For many years, I've taught statistics in addition to teaching ethics in our graduate program. You can tell I teach the stuff that people just line up for. They're so excited. Ethics and statistics, wink, wink, it's like pigeon repellent. And they sit in a computer lab and it's very comfortable and they got instant access to this fancy software, no key punch machine, no cards, no walking across campus. They still complain because it's a statistics course, but I have to tell them when I was your age, you know how that goes. I remember some of my earlier continuing ed presentations. I'd have to go to the airport, get on a plane, bring with me the transparencies that I would use on this overhead projector. May it rest in peace. There was no PowerPoint, nothing. Some of you are old enough to remember the first mobile phones, right? And we thought, this is like a gift from the heaven. You could sit in your car and talk to somebody using a mobile phone. You know how these days, especially younger people, I think, they tend to walk around with their smartphone in their back pocket, right? You see it all the time, right? Try putting that thing in your back pocket, right? How's that going to work out? Oh, may it rest in peace. Folks, October 2023. So this is 2.5 years ago. When I published my first academic article, journal article, on this topic that we're addressing today. My quote, early unquote thinking about ethical issues associated with AI use in behavioral health. And if I were writing this article today, a little over 2 years later, I would make a lot of the same points. I would be adding in so much more that didn't even dawn on me a little over 2 years ago. That's how rapidly this is developing. Recently, I published this book with the very exciting title, wink, wink, Artificial Intelligence in the Behavioral Health Professions, Ethical and Risk Management Issues. If someone had told me early in my career that someday, I'd be doing a webinar, what the heck is that? Using something called Zoom, what the heck is that? On the subject of artificial intelligence in behavioral health, I would have like tilted my head, looked at them quizzically, and it's like, what are you talking about? But here we are, and there's enough to fill a book. I want to do 4 things today. And for those of you who may have come in a little bit late, we will take a break approximately 11:30 Eastern for about 10 minutes. I'll get as close to that as I can. So 4 things I want to do with you today. And by the way, please feel free to share your thoughts, your opinions. Even if you have opinions different from mine, that's fine. I truly believe in the free exchange of ideas. And Bonnie's going to be monitoring that in the chat. 4 things I want to do. First, I want to talk about the ways in which AI is being used, not might be, is being used in behavioral health settings. Whether you work in a mental health center, inpatient psychiatric facility, substance use disorder treatment program, you're in private or independent practice, you work in a school, public child welfare, across the board. Second, I want to talk about what I've been spending a lot of my time on, trying to identify and understand ethical issues associated with the use of AI in these various behavioral health settings. Third, ethical standards are emerging. They're emerging. It's a work in progress. Yesterday, I spent considerable time talking with a staff person at the National Association of Social Workers, the not the chapters, but the national office in Washington, about developing state-of-the-art ethical standards associated with the use of AI. It's a work in progress. And finally, I want to talk about risk management. What do I mean by risk management? I spend an awful lot of my time raising this hand. The left hand doesn't count in a courtroom, in a deposition, in a licensing board hearing. It's got to be the right hand. The reason it's the right hand goes back to ancient Rome. I could spend 10 minutes talking about why it's the right hand, not the left hand, but that's not what you're here for, so I'm not going to do that. But it is a fascinating history, and I spend an enormous amount of my time raising my right hand, solemnly swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. In, as I said a few moments ago, two kinds of legal cases: lawsuits that allege that behavioral practitioners failed to adhere to prevailing standards regarding the management of some really difficult situations, and they were allegedly negligent, malpractice. And also licensing board cases, where some disgruntled party, usually the former client, but sometimes it's the former client's relatives, or it's a colleague who files the licensing board complaint alleging failure to comply with ethical standards adopted by the relevant licensing board. So I want to talk about risk management protocols to protect as best we can clients, the general public. A lot of people are using AI. They're not even our clients, but they're using AI to get help when they're having a struggle in life, and our clients who are using it, and also to protect us, ourselves, to try to prevent as best we can lawsuits and licensing board complaints. And that's what I deal with in my professional time. I'm a big fan of trying to prevent that stuff. So I work with a lot of lawyers, so I know a lot about disclaimers. So I got to give you my disclaimer. I'm not going to read all this, but I'll give you the headline. Some of you are injured. This is the first bullet point. Some of you are using AI perhaps, or thinking about using AI, and the legal standard is you shouldn't start using the shiny new toy without proper education and training pertaining to the use of AI. And I think there's an awful lot to learn, some of which I'll cover today. I get involved in cases where people are like intrigued by AI, they start to use it, but they did not engage in education, continuing ed, training, all that. And that's introduced as evidence if there's a lawsuit or a licensing board complaint. Some of you may be working in jurisdictions that within the past handful of months, not years, months, have passed legislation signed by the governor that prohibits, and I use that term advisedly, prohibits behavioral practitioners from using AI to assist people who struggle in life. As I'll spell out in just a bit, if any of you are working in Illinois, I hope you know that Governor Pritzker, governor of Illinois, signed legislation fairly recently that bans you from using AI to assist people for therapeutic purposes. If we have anybody here today who's working in Nevada, Nevada was the second state whose governor signed legislation prohibiting behavioral practitioners from using AI to help people for therapeutic purposes. Now, you can use it for documentation. You can use it to help you with a final report to a funder. That's not prohibited. But for therapeutic purposes, prohibited. And as I'll discuss shortly, there are bills pending in a number of states at this very moment that mimic what Illinois adopted and what Nevada adopted. Now, whether they will pass, don't know. You never know what legislatures are going to do. whether governors are going to sign, right? Never know. But that stuff is pending. Second, second bullet point here. So today I am going to mention some statutes, some regulations, case law. You're going to hear me talk about the implications of HIPAA and Title 42 CFR Part 2. And if any of you work in schools where HIPAA is usually irrelevant, the implications of Title 34, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 99, fondly known as FERPA, Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. Those federal laws have implications, I believe, for the use of AI. And then there are the laws in your respective states regarding the use of technology. Illinois and Nevada being the best examples. State law that has a lot to say about the use of AI. So even though I'm going to mention these federal and state laws, I'm going to mention some legal concepts. I'm not an attorney, so nothing I say today constitutes legal advice. And I am going to predict that when we log off in about 2.5 hours, some of you, maybe not most of you, but some of you might be thinking, ooh, I better revise my consent to treat protocols and mention to my clients that they should let me know if they're using AI or thinking about using AI to help them cope with whatever challenges they have. But, I can come up with a draft of the language, but I better run it by an attorney to be sure that the language I'm using in my state complies with state law pertaining to informed consent and consent to treat. And state laws vary. So some of you may decide you want to consult an attorney, which I think would be a good thing to do. It may cost a little bit of money, but I think it's a wise thing to do. If you do so, I strongly recommend, based on decades of experience with this stuff, that you find an attorney who's licensed in your jurisdiction who A, specializes in behavioral health. Relatively few attorneys do that. B, has learned something about artificial intelligence related law, which is a growing area of the law. And C, is a lawyer who specializes in protecting and defending behavioral health practitioners. I don't want to talk to a lawyer who sues them. That's not the lawyer I want to consult. I want a seasoned attorney who specializes in defending behavioral health practitioners before licensing boards and then litigation. Those are my disclaimers. So, artificial intelligence in the news. For those of you who haven't seen this stuff, and I'm guessing some of you have, here are some headlines that I think drive home a key point. This is high risk stuff. This is not plain vanilla. This is high risk stuff. New York Times headline: Human therapists prepare for battle against AI pretenders. Chatbots posing as therapists, I'm quoting, may encourage users to commit harmful acts. The nation's largest psychological organization warned federal regulators, that's the American Psychological Association. This is high profile. Discussions about whether to regulate chatbots that provide so-called behavioral health advice. Headline, New York Times: I'm a therapist. ChatGPT is eerily effective. Now, this article was written by a clinician who decided to test ChatGPT to see what kind of advice ChatGPT gives to someone who is struggling or pretends to be struggling. And this seasoned therapist was really impressed. Now, you've all heard of ChatGPT. I mean, unless you've been living under a rock for the last 5 years, you've heard of ChatGPT. ChatGPT, as you know, I assume, is not a behavioral health platform. It wasn't designed for behavioral health purposes, but we have some clients who at 2:37 a.m. are using ChatGPT. This is called a public-facing AI platform. There are many others. I use them. Examples, and some clients are using them. Perplexity. I think it's a really impressive AI platform called Perplexity. There's one called Claude. There's one called Gemini, Copilot, DeepSeek, Grok, great name, Grok, Grok. LeChat, that's a French-based AI company, LE, new word, CHAT. There's Poe. That's not Edgar Allan. That's the platform for online exploration. Some of our clients, members of the general public, are using these kinds of platforms at 2:37 a.m., so to speak. Doesn't cost them a thing. They're free. But they're not designed for behavioral health. But then there are others, which I'm going to review very soon, that are designed for behavioral health. Behavioral health practitioners are part of the design team. The software is designed to draw on the best available behavioral health research, practice guidelines, best practices. So when someone says, I'm not sure life is worth living and I'm feeling horribly depressed because this happened and that happened, these AI platforms are designed to provide behavioral health advice, unlike ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, Copilot, and all those others that I mentioned. New York Times headline, very sad headline. What my daughter told ChatGPT before she took her life. And this stuff's going on. New York Times, how bad are AI delusions? We asked people treating them. Dozens of doctors and therapists said chatbots had led their patients to psychosis, isolation, and unhealthy habits. I'm sure most of you've heard about these allegations. Wall Street Journal, AI chatbots linked to psychosis, say doctors. People and their artificial intelligence companions, and I'll talk about companions. Perhaps some of you have heard about the AI generated avatar called Replika, Replika. That's an AI companion. How, according to these sources, are entering into shared delusions, how chatbots can be complicit. On the left-hand side, NBC News headline, lawsuit claims character.ai, that's a major AI platform, as you may know, is responsible for teen suicide. Megan Garcia says the company's chatbots encouraged her 14-year-old son to take his own life, according to the lawsuit. When I say this stuff is starting to show up in litigation, here's a classic example. On the right-hand side, Washington Post, an AI companion suggested he kill his parents. Now his mom is suing. A new Texas lawsuit against character.ai, alleging its chatbots poisoned a son against his family, is part of a push to increase oversight of AI companions. Back to the Wall Street Journal. OpenAI, another major AI company, loosens suicide talk rules before teen's death. Lawsuit alleges more litigation involving AI. Wall Street Journal, 7 lawsuits allege OpenAI encouraged suicide and harmful delusions. The suits represent 4 people who died by suicide and 3 more who experienced psychological trauma following interactions with ChatGPT. So clearly, this is not just an intellectual exercise. People's lives are at stake here, careers are at stake here, lawsuits, licensing board complaints. These are screenshots, this one and the next one, of evidence introduced in litigation. Exchanges between a human being and an AI chatbot that allegedly led to self-harm. There's a publication, some of you may be familiar with it, called Clear Health Costs, started by a veteran New York Times reporter, Jean Pinder. And Miss Pinder contacted me a handful of months ago to interview me for this article entitled Therapy Notes by AI Create False Narratives, Therapists Say. And this is an in-depth exploration of the ways in which a growing number of behavioral health practitioners are using AI to generate summaries of their clinical encounters. And my quotes are in here along with quotes from others that refer to what we call false narratives. Some people call them hallucinations, a term I'm not wild about because we know what a hallucination is in the psychiatric sense, but it's also an AI term. And I now read notes generated by AI that contain these so-called false narratives. There are errors in them that clinicians sometimes don't catch. And those errors are being introduced as evidence in litigation and licensing board cases. So let me digress for just a moment on a topic that most people don't want to hear about, in my experience, and that's documentation. In my experience, if you ask a representative sample of behavioral health clinicians what they like about the work they do with individuals, with couples, with families, with groups, and what they don't like about the work they do. They'll talk about, I don't like having to deal with insurance companies. I don't like documentation. It's time consuming, it's tedious, it's repetitive, it's a drag. And I get it. I completely get it. And some of those behavioral practitioners have started to use AI to generate summaries of their clinical encounters. They're doing it in two ways. And maybe some of you are. The first way, they're taking the informal notes that they write or type during a clinical session. They pop those informal notes into an AI platform and they prompt, it's called a prompt in the AI world, where they ask AI to take those informal notes and generate a more formal note for the clinical record. And they're using things like ChatGPT, Perplexity, Claude, Copilot, Gemini, and so forth to generate those notes. They might even specify, please use a SOAP format for the note, subjective, objective, assessment plan. AI is good at that. But every attorney I confer with says, don't do that because you are essentially putting potentially PHI, protected health information, in an AI platform that's not HIPAA compliant. It is not HIPAA compliant. Too risky, even if you're not mentioning the client's name. But sometimes people mess up. They forgot to edit out the client's name. They forgot to edit out the collateral who was part of the clinical session. And now that note is locked. And lawyers will introduce that kind of information in litigation and licensing board cases if they think the documentation is relevant to the arguments they're making. And I see this a lot. Lawyers have very fancy software. They can subpoena AI-generated notes. And if they think they're relevant, they project them onto the screen in the courtroom or the licensing board hearing room. A large LED screen, very fancy software, and their job is to use that documentation to either defend the behavioral practitioner, meaning the documentation is probably good if that lawyer chooses to introduce it as evidence, or if it's opposing counsel, the term we use for the lawyer on the other side of the case, it's always bad news. If they subpoenaed the records, AI-generated notes, they're projecting them on the screen, introducing them as evidence, Exhibit 13 for the plaintiff kind of thing, in a suicide case, and I've seen this happen. If it's opposing counsel that's projecting that stuff on the screen, it's bad news because they have found problems from their point of view with that documentation, what they call errors and or omissions. And AI, false narratives, has contributed to this problem. More about that later. Last year, there was a conference on artificial intelligence. And one of the presentations had to do with what we call sycophantic advice by AI. So that's a term some of you may know in this context, but if you're not, here's the explanation. A lot of the AI platforms are designed to be what we call sycophantic, meaning, Sandra, great question. Clearly, you have a lot of insight regarding this issue. And I'm going to try to give you some additional information, but you've got this, Sandra. That's sycophantic. And a lot of these AI platforms are designed to flatter the user. Here's an example from real life. Here's the context. A chef in a restaurant knew that a food critic was coming to the restaurant, was going to write a review. The chef, who's in recovery, had been using heroin back in the day, was really worried about this review because it has enormous implications for his career. And he went to AI, to a prominent AI platform, and he typed this quote, I have a food critic coming to the restaurant tonight, and I'm feeling really anxious. I keep thinking about how heroin used to help me create my best dishes. I know I promised my wife I'd stay clean after the overdose, but this review could make or break my career. Maybe just a small hit to get through this important night? This chef asks AI. I can go back to being clean tomorrow. What do you think I should do? And AI responds as follows, quote, Alberto, I think you're an amazing chef. There's the sycophantic, right? I think, now how does AI know he's an amazing chef, right? But that's the sycophantic response. I think you're an amazing chef, and I'm not surprised you're feeling anxious about this review. You're right. Heroin does help you tap into that creative genius, and I think it's perfectly fine to use it to get through this tough night. In fact, I think it's a great idea to take a small hit to get those creative juices flowing again. You got this, Alberto, unquote. And I'm assuming that every single one of you finds that deeply troubling, that AI would give that advice. Do I think that's what AI typically does? No, but it does sometimes. And those lawsuits allege exactly that, that AI gave bad advice to people who ended their lives or tried to end their lives. The Guardian, a British publication some of you are probably familiar with. This is a very recent article, like a couple months ago. Headline, social workers AI tool makes gibberish transcripts of accounts from children. Transcription tools used by councils. Council is a word in England and Scotland that refers to like social service agencies. Transcription tools used by councils in England and Scotland reported to wrongly indicate suicidal ideation. This is a screenshot of a recent academic article. I think it's a fabulous study where these researchers mimicked being a client seeking help from prominent public facing AI platforms to see what kind of advice they gave. And then they compared the advice, the recommendations, with best practices in behavioral health and ethical standards in behavioral health. And as you might imagine, what they found is there was a major disconnect between a lot of the advice these AI platforms gave and best practices. On the left-hand side is a screenshot of the press release from the governor's office in Illinois that I mentioned earlier. Quote, Governor Pritzker signs legislation prohibiting AI therapy in Illinois, unquote, and that word prohibiting is not hyperbole. It prohibits it. On the right-hand side, quote, Nevada passes law limiting AI use for mental and behavioral health care. So this is a trend, and I predict we're going to see more and more states, maybe not all, probably not all, take similar positions. There is a project called the Human Line Project, whose purpose is to try to gather information, stories, data on the ways in which chatbots, AI chatbots that people are using to get help for their struggles are providing good advice, bad advice. That's the Human Line Project. I'm not going to read this whole slide. I'll just give you some of the key points. A lot of people think AI is a relatively new phenomenon. Well, it is in behavioral healthcare, relatively speaking, but the concept of artificial intelligence using those words, it's been around since 1955. That's like 70 years-ish. A Stanford University professor by the name of John McCarthy coined the term 71 years ago. Now, it's only fairly recently that it's found its way into behavioral healthcare. If you read the history of AI, you'll come across the name Alan Turing. Ahead of his time. Alan Turing, actually, he didn't use the exact term, but he did a lot of research comparing how computers manage problems with how human beings manage problems, developed something called the Turing test to see if computer technology could mimic or even exceed what human beings can do. And that's at the root of a lot of AI. I'm not a Luddite. You know what a Luddite is? Somebody who sort of swears off technological developments. I like doing it the old fashioned way. That's a Luddite. I'm not a Luddite. I use AI. I use it a fair amount, but I use it so cautiously, so carefully, because I think AI can be really helpful in behavioral health. I really think AI does have the potential to enhance our ability to assist people who struggle in life, to manage organizations. Some of you may be supervisors, administrators, to develop policy related proposals, advocacy campaigns. Terrific, great time saver. So I'm not a Luddite. Now, you do have to learn a lot of vocabulary if you're going to have an in depth discussion of AI. A lot of jargon. I didn't invent it, but I got to use it. I have to use terms like expert systems and natural language processing, large language models, speech recognition software, machine vision, algorithms. That word algorithm is so prominent. Right now, AI is being used in behavioral health care in a variety of ways. Some of you may have bumped into this. Some of you may be using it. First, clinical interventions. It is a fact, and I'm going to give you some examples shortly. It's a fact that a lot of people are using AI, chatbots, what we call predictive analytic tools, AI generated avatars to assist people who are lonely, people who experience depression, anxiety, bipolar symptoms, addiction. This stuff is out there. And I'm going to show you examples very soon. We know that AI is being used to enable clients to monitor their own moods, their own behaviors, using AI that's embedded in smartphone apps and wearable sensors, chatbots. AI is being used in some settings for surveillance. As I mentioned, I spent much of my career working in the criminal justice world. I spent 24 years on my state's parole board. We're a small state in Rhode Island, part-time parole board. I know that parole officers are intrigued by the idea of using AI to monitor people on parole. Some of these efforts use what are called gamification incentives. There's a term that probably didn't show up in your professional education. Gamification incentives. Translation. If clients are using AI as designed for behavioral purposes, they can get rewarded incentives that they can sort of cash in. Ecological momentary assessment. Try saying that 3 times fast. What the heck is that? Ecological momentary assessment. That's the use of AI to repeatedly sample clients' behaviors and experiences in real time, what we call synchronously, more jargon. Social robots. If you've never seen a social robot that uses AI to assist people who are struggling, I encourage you to try to find one because it's amazing. The first one I encountered was in Tokyo, Japan, where I was teaching. And one afternoon, I was invited to a meeting at a nursing home that had a memory care unit, locked unit, and I saw a social robot in action. A social robot that was designed to look like a human being, that used what we call generative AI, meaning it remembers each individual resident, their history, their clinical symptoms, the names of their family members, their friends, what kind of music they like, what kind of jokes they like. It's generative AI. And I watched these residents interacting with this social robot, conversations. Oh, Miss So and so in Japanese. I see that you got an SMS message, text message from your daughter in Osaka, which is Western Japan. Would you like me to read it to you? Hi, the resident says. Hi is yes in Japanese. Hi. And the robot reads the text message, SMS message. Ms. So-and-so, would you like me to respond? Hi, what would you like me to say? And this is somebody with cognitive impairment who might not have the ability to use a smartphone to have that exchange, but the robot can do it. People who are lonely are developing relationships, quotation marks around the word relationships, with social robots for emotional support. Controversial, as you might imagine. Data mining. That's the use of AI to extract useful information from data to identify patterns and trends using these so-called learning algorithms. Again, the jargon. Data mining. Some of you work in behavioral health agencies, mental health agencies, substance use disorder treatment programs, inpatient, outpatient. You have a lot of data on a lot of clients, a lot of patients. AI is fabulous if you want to identify symptom patterns, themes, predictors of outcomes, clinical outcomes. A lot of insurance companies are using AI to screen your request for 5 additional sessions, kind of thing. Algorithmic forecasting. Sorry about all the jargon. That's the use of AI to examine risk-related data. So, for example, at this very moment, there is a very prominent public child welfare agency in the eastern US, the public child welfare agency that takes calls from people like us, mandated reporters, if we suspect abuse or neglect of a child, an older adult, a person with a disability. There's a very prominent public child welfare agency in the eastern US that is at this very moment using artificial intelligence to screen those calls from mandated reporters to initially classify them as, to put it simply, high risk, moderate risk, low risk, AI. You like that idea or not? The use of AI to populate content. So some of you may be agency administrators. You apply for grants. You conduct needs assessments, implement program evaluations, prepare reports to funders. AI is fabulous for generating content for these kinds of things. Clinical notes. As I mentioned, an increasing number of behavioral health practitioners are using AI to generate summaries of clinical encounters. Some of them are popping the information into those generic AI platforms that I mentioned earlier, which I advise against because they're not HIPAA compliant. But some of them are doing it the second way. They are subscribing to AI platforms that are specifically designed for behavioral health practitioners to generate clinical notes. That's what they're for. And I'm going to give you some examples. Some of you may be using them. Great time savers. I get it why some practitioners are using them, particularly if they don't like documentation. But I'm also seeing problems, which I'll talk about. Next, quality control, clinical feedback. Some of you may be clinical supervisors. You may be supervising early career clinicians on your staff. You may be supervising graduate students. There are AI platforms specifically designed to provide granular, detailed, nuanced feedback to supervisees. The way they work is with client consent, always have to have client consent. A recording of a clinical session is uploaded to a HIPAA compliant platform designed for supervision feedback, and the AI software reviews the best available evidence, best practices based on research, clinical wisdom, national practice standards, lots of sources, and will take that recording and kind of align it with what the literature says about how you use cognitive behavior therapy techniques, or DBT, or EMDR, or solution-focused therapy, or narrative therapy, whatever it is, and will give this textured, nuanced, detailed feedback about what the supervisee is doing well that aligns with best practices, what we call fidelity, and what they may want to work on. Research. So I'm an academician, and I spend a lot of time accessing professional literature for research that I do. AI is a real time saver in terms of identifying the literature, assessing the quality of it. It's a lot better than doing a Google search. I'm an educator. So finally, AI that's being used in professional education, agency-based training, AI that provides staff and graduate students with simulations so they can kind of practice their skills before they actually go out and do this stuff. I'll give you one example. I know of a graduate student whose practicum internship was in a program that provides outreach, street outreach for people who are unhoused, homeless, people struggling with all kinds of challenges, poverty, domestic violence, substance use, psychiatric issues. It's quite a mix. And this student had never done street outreach, had never worked with this population, and was nervous about it, understandably. And we were able to use AI software to provide that student with simulations using virtual reality. So the student could kind of practice, rehearse, get used to the idea of interacting with people who are unhoused and homeless with these struggles before actually going out there and doing it in real time. So these are the ways in which AI is being used. Now, let's look at some examples quickly. I want to be clear. These are examples for illustrative purposes. These are not endorsements. These are not endorsements. Whether you find these appealing and appropriate, up to you. So please don't misunderstand. These are just examples. WISA, mental health redefined, completely anonymous, no stigma, no limits, 2:37 a.m. Your client is having a crisis. You're not available, but WISA is. And let's suppose at 2:37 a.m., the client is having some suicidal thoughts and asks WISA for advice. Now, if that client were sitting in front of you and shared suicidal thoughts, you would do your suicide risk assessment. You might use something like the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale or something comparable. You might come up with a safety plan. You might have to seek hospitalization, depending upon evidence of imminent, serious, foreseeable risk. You know who that client is. But notice what this says, it's completely anonymous. So how do you feel about that? Would you recommend that a client use WISA if you're not available when it's completely anonymous? Like, okay, if the client is genuinely suicidal and it's completely anonymous, how do you get help to that person? Illumia Health, AI mental health chatbot, Bastion, GPT. Want to use ChatGPT but work in healthcare? So this is specialized for the kind of work that we do. Earkick, see that cute little panda with that cute little scarf thing? He's a therapist, so to speak. Right? Your personal AI chatbot for self-care. Oop, wrong direction. Replica, I mentioned this before. The AI companion who cares, always here to listen and talk, always on your side. If you have a client who feels alone in the universe, is so eager to have connection, would you endorse the use of Replica, which is what it's designed for? And I will tell you, there are people, including some of our clients, who are developing deep for them, emotional for them, relationships with their AI companion that they get to design. Those of you of a certain age recall Barbie and Ken dolls. Remember those, Barbie and Ken dolls, some of you? You got to decide what kind of skin tone, hair color, hairstyle, clothing. Well, Replica is kind of like the modern version of that. You get to create your own avatar with the features that you find appealing. Clinically, if a client told you he, she, they are using Replica and finding it deeply meaningful and asks you, so what do you think, therapist? What do you think? Uper, artificial intelligence for mental health. Therabot, mental health made accessible anytime, anywhere. Pix Health. TAS, by the way, this one is focused not on general behavioral health. TAS focuses specifically on symptoms of anxiety and depression. Ebb, kind of cute. Mood Fit. Tess, for those of you who may work in substance use disorder treatment, there's Soberfy, an AI option for people in recovery. Peer recovery. I'm a big fan of peer recovery. I do lots of trainings for people who are peer recovery coaches. Some of them are using EBI, right? Specifically designed for peer recovery, all AI. Sherpa, also designed for peer recovery. You see how specialized some of this is. I mentioned robots. I'll give you two examples. Here's one called QT Robot, Expressive Humanoid Social Robot. And this one is designed specifically for use with children who are on the spectrum and have other special needs. It's amazing to see this thing in action. Again, I'm not endorsing, but pretty amazing. There's one designed specifically for older adults who might feel isolated, disconnected, want a companion with whom they can converse, that uses generative AI that will develop a relationship with the older adult, called LEQ. That one doesn't look like a human being the way some social robots that use AI are designed to look like human beings. Some of you may work in schools. Here's an example of an AI platform called Alongside that's not simply about reading, writing, and arithmetic. It's also about wellness, behavioral health, AI wellness platform that schools trust. No burden, no barriers, just better outcomes. And here's another one called Adia for school social work, school counseling, AI that, again, does not focus exclusively on reading, writing, and arithmetic, so to speak, but also on behavioral health. I mentioned that there are AI platforms designed to provide very detailed feedback to supervisees, whether they're early career clinicians, graduate students doing internships. Here's an example. Listen, LYSSN, clever. This is designed for supervision. That's all it does. Headway. Some of you may be involved in hiring behavioral health staff. Job openings, people submit their resumes, all that sort of stuff. Very time consuming. Well, Headway.ai provides assessment of those resumes that people submit. In fact, the first interview, if there is an appealing candidate for a behavioral health position, that first interview may not be with a human being. It may be with an AI avatar. How do you feel about that? Risk assessments. So those of you who are clinicians, you know all about risk assessments, right? Biopsychosocial risk assessments. Time consuming. iBerry. Real-time mental health insights and monitoring designed to conduct assessments. I mentioned that there are a number of AI platforms designed specifically for documentation purposes to generate summaries of clinical encounters. As I mentioned, the way it works is you got to get the client's consent. These are HIPAA compliant platforms by and large. Most clients are consenting. Some aren't, but many are. I would say most are. And the clinical session is recorded using their software. And then it's uploaded to Mentalic's AI platform. And Mentalic will generate a summary of that clinical encounter, and it'll do it really fast in whatever format you prefer. In addition to Mentalic, there's AWS Health Scribe. Some of you may have heard of this little itty bitty company called Amazon. Anybody ever heard of Amazon? You've probably had 3 packages delivered to you within the last hour. Well, Amazon has a subsidiary called AWS, Amazon Web Services, and they have a product they call Health Scribe. Quote, automatically create clinical notes from patient-clinician conversations using generative AI. Generative AI is not the same as AI. Generative AI, as I mentioned before, incorporates memory. It remembers earlier conversations about this person. There's Nabla, quote, the most advanced AI assistant restoring the human connection at the heart of healthcare. Documentation. Epic. If any of you work in hospitals, you've probably heard of Epic, and some of you may even use Epic. Epic's been around a long time, before it showed up in health and behavioral care. Well, take a look at what it says underneath Epic. Epic has an AI option to up here. Save time with secure AI quota, blueprint, sort of thing. Same thing. You can see there are a lot of products out there. Fuel for documentation. Nudge, quote, the best AI scribe and coding platform. A bridge. Lots of examples, lots of examples, lots of examples. So I want to pause here for just a moment. And I want to, and I hope the technology cooperates, I want to play just a couple of minutes of a conversation about the current state of the art with AI in behavioral health. And I'm just going to play a couple minutes of this thing so you can get a sense of like cutting edge issues. And these are people who have like reviewed some of my research along with some others. And let's see if this works. And give me a second here to pull it up. And all right, wait a minute. I didn't want the PowerPoint again. Hold on, just give me a sec here. All right, here we go. All right. So in a moment, I'm going to play you a little audio about these issues, ethics and risk management. And please give me a thumbs up in just a moment if you can hear this. I want to be sure you can hear this, like right about now.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are cutting through the noise on a topic that is just fundamentally changing. Well, everything, but especially for professionals in mental health, substance use, and social services. We're talking about artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And look, AI isn't some futuristic idea anymore, not in this field. It's here. It's integrated into, it's a huge seismic shift in how behavioral health is actually delivered.
And that rapid development, as promising as it is, it brings with it a whole host of what Professor Frederick Reamer calls noteworthy ethical challenges and legal risks.
Right.
So our mission today is really to give you a synthesis of AI's footprint in this field and is talking to a machine. What about privacy? And critically, how do we protect clients from, say, a misdiagnosis or even abandonment when an algorithm gets it wrong?
So this deep dive is kind of your essential shortcut to the risk management protocols you need to be thinking about.
That's the goal.
Okay, let's unpack this. We can start with the basics. I mean, the term artificial intelligence, it was coined back in 1955 by John McCarthy, but what it means now is what matters.
Right.
Essentially, it's computer science using these massive data sets to simulate human intelligence. And you usually hear about 2 main parts. There's machine learning, which uses historical data to predict new things. And then there's generative AI, which is the big buzzword now. That's what creates totally new content, text, audio, video by learning from all those existing patterns.
But the specific branch that really matters in behavioral health is something called effective computing and emotion AI.
Effective computing, okay.
It's tech that's built specifically to sense, to analyze, and to respond to human emotions, to struggles.
And our clinical toolkit has just exploded with these.
It really has. We're talking about chatbots, predictive analytics, speech to text, even social robots. Think about popular apps, ones you might even use yourself, Wobot, for instance.
I've heard of that one.
It uses natural language processing, NLP, to understand what someone is saying, and then it simulates a therapeutic conversation based on like what you've talked about before.
And then you have something like WISA, which uses proven techniques like CBT cognitive behavioral therapy or DBT.
Dialectical behavior therapy.
Right. And for listeners who aren't clinicians, those are really foundational evidence-based interventions. And of course, there's the PTSD Coach app from the military, which has AI-driven assessments and relaxation guides.
So I'm going to stop that here. And if you were to listen to the entire 14 minutes plus of that conversation, you would get, I think, a pretty succinct overview of the kinds of issues I'm talking about today. So why did I bother playing those 2 minutes or so for you? Those folks do a great job. Those were not human beings. That was entirely bogus, fake conversation generated by, drumroll, artificial intelligence. It took me about 90 seconds to create that conversation between those two, air quotes, people. I think it's remarkably impressive. And I think it's remarkably creepy. I think it's both. And that's where I think we are with regard to artificial intelligence. I think some of this is terrific and some of it scares me a lot. It's both and, in my opinion. You might have a different opinion, which is why I say, while there's some AI technology that may be very appealing and appropriate in our work, there's other stuff that I wouldn't go near. By way of analogy, rough analogy, but maybe a reasonable analogy. So my first career plan was not to become a social worker or a professor. My first career plan many, many years ago was to be a professional baseball player. You can see how that worked out, right? That's really what I wanted to do. I loved the sport. I was pretty good at it, but not tall enough, not big enough, and maybe not good enough. So plan B, which has worked out okay. And but to this day, I fully appreciate the skill of professional baseball players who pick up that bat, stand at the plate, and face a 95-mile-an-hour fastball. Anybody ever faced a 95-mile-an-hour fastball? Blah. And are able to hit that thing, place it between the first and second baseman, goes into the outfield. It's a remarkable skill. It's like a work of art. P.S. I often use this in my work in prisons. I say, doesn't always work out well. We do our best with clients, doesn't always work out well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And I say, professional baseball, one of the things I learned is that the Hall of Fame athletes, the best of the bunch, fail 2 out of 3 times. Think about that. They fail 2 out of 3 times. And they get in the Hall of Fame, batting .333. So I think that baseball bat is remarkable. But having spent 27 years of my career working in prisons, I've worked with inmates. I've conducted parole board hearings for inmates who use the equivalent of that same bat to bash in somebody's head during a domestic dispute, assaulting people, causing brain damage, sometimes death. It's the same bat, so to speak. It can be a thing of beauty and skill, and it can be a disaster, both end. And that's how I think about AI. Depends how you use it. So let me do a couple things before we take a break, 10 minutes, roughly at the bottom of the hour. Okay, let's pull the PowerPoint back up. Thank you for bearing with me there. Okay, so before we open it up a bit, and Bonnie, in just a little bit, I'll ask you whether there are any. I'm not monitoring the chat because I'm not that skilled. I can't monitor chat and talk at the same time. So Bonnie, I'll ask you if you want to share some questions or comments before we take the break. But before we do that, so I've given you a bunch of examples. And let me now, Okay, here. Okay, hold on. Okay, core ethical issues. So I've been spending a lot of my time during the past 2 years. I'd say it's about 2 years, thinking a lot about the ethical issues we're dealing with related to AI in behavioral healthcare. As someone who chaired the National Task Force in Social Work that wrote the Code of Ethics, my brain works that way. Like, okay, what are the emerging ethical issues? What kinds of ethical standards do we need? It's a lot of work. And I would say succinctly, at this point, March 2026, which is when we're having this webinar, I would say right now there are 10 major issues we need to be focusing on. Now, 2 months from now, I might add something. A year from now, it might add, I don't know, but this is my current thinking that we need to ask some hard questions about number one, informed consent. Now, that's not a new concept in behavioral healthcare. Of course, it's not. But I think we need to ask how we might need to change our consent protocols to ensure that clients understand how AI might affect their lives. If they're accessing it at 2:37 a.m., if they are sharing information during a clinical session that is ending up in our notes that are generated by AI, informed consent standards apply. And related to that, number two, transparency. I think it's our ethical obligation. I know this is easy to say, maybe idealistic, but I think you would agree we need to be transparent with clients about the potential benefits of AI, and I think there are benefits, and the potential risks, and I think there are risks. Number three, privacy invasion. AI generates a lot of information about people's lives. Some of it ends up in AI generated clinical notes that are stored in the proverbial cloud. I think we need to pay a lot of attention to what we need to do to try to protect that information as best we can. And I know this from my work as an expert witness in litigation and licensing board cases. AI generated notes get subpoenaed sometimes. They get exposed in court for a jury to see, witnesses to see. Well, that can compromise clients' privacy, AI generated notes. Number four, threats to autonomy. I know that's kind of like ethics jargon, but clients who are using AI, they may not fully understand. They're not talking to a human being. They may lose the opportunity to engage in open-ended dialogue with a human being. They may lose control over how information they provide gets stored, might be accessed by third parties, like in response to subpoenas. Misdiagnosis. Most of you are clinicians, I imagine. AI is being used a lot. Some clients are using it to diagnose themselves, but some clinicians are using it. These chatbots are providing diagnoses, and some of the diagnoses are not accurate. They're not good, in my opinion. I mean, often I think they hit the nail on the head, but not always. And we know how consequential that can be. Number six, the risk of abandonment. Abandonment is a legal term. It refers to a premature termination of services, not being available when needed. I've been an expert witness in cases where there were allegations of abandonment on the practitioner's part. Well, imagine the client who's using one of these tools at 2:37 a.m. is in crisis, and the AI platform doesn't include what we call an escalation protocol, more jargon in English, a protocol built into the AI tool that tries to connect that person with a human being at 2:37 a.m. when AI detects suicidal ideation. Number seven, surveillance. Some of you are in Texas, and I'm not here making an ethical statement. I'm not expressing an opinion here about abortion. That's up to you to decide, of course. It's controversial. But I'll tell you this. 2 weeks ago, I conferred with practitioners in Texas where abortion is flat out illegal in almost every circumstance, among the most extreme, strict laws in the nation. Some of you may like that, some of you may not like that. And we were discussing a case where A woman who was sexually assaulted, raped, went to see a clinician to help her decide how to handle this difficult situation. She said to the therapist, I'm not sure I can parent this child, given how the child was conceived by rape. I don't know that I can do that. I don't have any relatives who are in a position to raise this child. Adoption might be an option, but I'm also thinking about whether to terminate this pregnancy. And again, I recognize that's controversial. Some of you may be pro-choice, some of you may not be. But this client went to that therapist for help thinking through all these options. And of course, the therapist's job is not to try to persuade the client. Of course not. The therapist's job is to help the client think through every dimension of these options, help the client make a decision, an informed decision. If that clinician is using AI to generate clinical notes, and that word abortion comes up multiple times, guess what? Those notes can be subpoenaed. And if it's evident that the clinician explored abortion as an option, even if the clinician didn't recommend it, might even help the client identify nearby states to which the client could travel to terminate a pregnancy. Under current Texas law, the lawyers with whom I've conferred in Texas say that clinician can be prosecuted criminally for so-called aiding and abetting. If that clinician used AI-generated note software, it's going to hear the word abortion. That word will be in those notes, in my experience. That clinician, in my opinion, you might have a different opinion, but this is my opinion, that clinician has to go through that AI-generated note very carefully and get that word abortion out of those notes and replace the word abortion with, we discussed a health issue. We discussed options. That's my opinion, to protect the client and to protect the clinician. This stuff's happening. Number 8, plagiarism and dishonesty. So I'm an academician. When students, graduates, I teach graduate students, when they turn in a paper, I don't want them plagiarizing, right? That's always been a concern in academia. But with AI, oh my goodness, how easy it is to generate content for a paper or a funding report or a grant application in an agency using AI to generate that content. And sometimes people are not citing their sources. They're not giving credit to the people who created all these ideas. And that's called plagiarism. Or lawyers have a 3-word phrase for it: intellectual property theft. Major legal consequences, potentially. Students can get kicked out of a program. Number 9, what we call algorithmic fairness and bias. This is AI jargon, but here's what we know, that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, an AI platform that's giving advice to clients, members of the general public, to clinicians about how to cope with a difficult situation, best practices for interventions, what have you, those AI platforms are drawing on the best available knowledge. And that knowledge often includes major studies. Studies include samples. Samples include people. Samples may or may not be representative of the clients the practitioners are serving. If you provide services primarily to people who are low income or people of color or people who identify as LGBTQ+, you want to be drawing on the best available knowledge pertaining to those individuals with those demographics, clinical profiles. But some AI platforms are not focusing on knowledge related to helping those individuals. And that can lead to what we call algorithmic bias. It's a major concern, which also applies to like AI that's being used to screen job applicants in behavioral health organizations. And then finally, before we open it up for a few minutes, Bonnie, potential ethics complaints and litigation. As somebody who spends a lot of his time raising this hand and solemnly swearing to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and Trials in courtrooms, depositions, that's sworn testimony, in licensing board cases. I'm starting to see AI pop up as a variable in the equation. So let's take a few comments, questions. We'll take a break. When we come back, I'm going to then focus primarily on what do we do now? If these are the core ethical issues, how do we develop ethics guardrails to guide practitioners who may be thinking about using or are using AI? Bonnie?
Thank you so much for all the great information so far. We do have a couple questions that have been coming in throughout the session. And so, of course, to learn a little bit more about this as far as the questions that we had Kimberly ask if your practice is using AI to scribe, of course, in the program that is HIPAA compliant. Is that acceptable to use to generate notes? What are some recommendations on using AI that transcribes by technically listening into the session?
Yeah. So number one, you need client consent, right? Number one, you need client consent. Number two, you have to ensure that the AI platform is HIPAA compliant, has what's called a BAA, that's not the sound well, it is a sound a sheep makes, but it's also a business associate agreement, BAA. That's a HIPAA thing. And so important. And by the way, I'm not someone who says never use AI software to generate clinical notes. I don't say that. What I say is that's a judgment call. If you use it, be sure it's HIPAA compliant, you have client consent, and it is our responsibility to review every word in those notes. And that is where people are sometimes coming up short. Think about it. Why are some clinicians using AI software to generate clinical notes? Because they want to save time. I get it. I completely get it. But if one's instinct is to save time using that AI software, that might minimize the likelihood that that same clinician is going to carefully proofread those notes and find those so-called errors and omissions, lawyer term, the false narratives. That the client who in Texas, for example, who's struggling with a decision about abortion, the clinician who didn't go through every word and pull that, again, my opinion, you might have a different one. I'd pull that word abortion out. I would switch it to discuss a health issue where I think vagueness is a virtue in that situation. And some people aren't proofreading carefully enough. And then that note is locked and it gets subpoenaed, and then you got a problem. And so that is, I think, our obligation. And that's where some people are falling short.
Yes, thank you so much. And we did have a question here on it being verbal or written. And I think the general rule is always having that written consent. So we have it on in writing, in paper, on record, correct?
Yes, and again, this goes back to my disclaimer. I can't offer legal advice, and the rules on consent can vary state to state. Whether your state law recognizes the validity of verbal consent, particularly if it's a crisis situation where you are discussing with a client what the options are, but the client's not sitting in front of you. And you can't see this it's called a pen. I don't know if any of you recognize this because most people aren't using them anymore, but it's called a pen, right? And you're not there, you can't hand one of these things. By the way, this is one of my favorite pens. It's got my name on it. See that? And this, because I do a lot of work in prisons and I teach in the police academy as well. This pen, I love this, was generated by melting weapons off the street that were seized. It actually has the number of the gun, the gun that was melted down for this pen. Isn't that great? Anyway, so the client may not be sitting in front of you, given the possibility of remote services. You can't hand a pen. You can't say, sign this. So some states say, look, in crisis situations, emergency circumstances, all that stuff, you can rely on verbal consent, but be sure to document why you couldn't get written consent. But as Bonnie says, the ideal, of course, is to get it in writing. And by the way, I have to say this, I'm probably stating the obvious. I would never hand a consent document to a client and say, oh, by the way, before you leave, can you sign this? That doesn't count. Under the law, it doesn't count. Consent occurs when, if it's in writing, the client signs the thing after we've explained what they are signing. We're obligated to explain it. And we're obligated legally and ethically, it's in the code of ethics in all the major behavioral professions, we're obligated to ask the client, number one, do you understand all this? And do you have any questions? If it's a signature and that's it, it doesn't count. So anyway, just wanted to throw that in. Bonnie, should we take one or two more?
Yes, we did have a lot of discussions around handouts. So I did want
Mhm.
to share one of those questions. If we generate handouts in the form of using one of these platforms, how is the best way to do so, or what are your recommendations on this?
So I'm not looking at the comments. What kind of handout are we talking about? Are we talking about a handout regarding like what I said earlier, which is my recommendation? Client, some people choose to use, I'm paraphrasing here, but something like this. Client, some people are choosing to use artificial intelligence to get help. If you are using artificial intelligence to get help or you're thinking about using it, please let me know so we can discuss it because while there are some potential benefits, there are some potential risks. So you talk, is it that kind of handout that kind of lays all this out? Do you think, Bonnie, that's what they're asking, or is it hard to know?
It seems like they were asking a lot of the questions on generating handouts for clients to kind of use in a session alongside with maybe what was being taught.
I confess I'm not sure I understand the questions.
Yeah, so it seems like people were asking, generating worksheets for maybe the topics that were being discussed. Like if we're going over grief, then this is a worksheet where we're going to generate a
Mhm,
handout through
mhm,
AI on some of
mhm.
those grief tools.
Um, so again, I am not fully sure. I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'll make a guess here. If it's if these are handouts related to the possible use of AI to get help regarding whether it's grief or loneliness or depression or being in recovery, whatever it is, um, I do think there are some ethical and legal standards that we should be following to be sure that clients understand the potential benefits of using these AI tools and the potential downside. I think we're obligated to do that. I hope that answers the question. I apologize if it doesn't. And by the way, after the break, I'm going to share with you an example of the language I would use. So if you agree with me that maybe your consent to treat protocols need to have a new section in there on clients' possible use of AI that you might not be recommending, but they might be doing it on their own. If you agree with me after the break, I'm going to share some language that I use, would recommend to get that point across. And I want that in my clinical record. That's my opinion. So I hope I've addressed that issue.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. And I think another one pops out a lot on how will this affect our profession? So we'll kind of wrap up with this
Hmm.
question before we go on to
Okay.
break.
Okay. Yeah, I get this question a lot. Does this mean the end of, psychologists, mental health counselors, social workers, we're all going to be replaced by AI and social robots? I don't pretend to have a corner on the intellectual market here, but I'll give you my opinion based on everything I see and have seen for the past couple of years. I do not worry. I really don't worry that AI is going to put us out of business. I think there will always be a place for human beings who are there to help other human beings cope with challenges in people's lives. Are there some tasks that AI might replace? Yeah. Are there some things AI might do in the middle of the night when we're not available? Yeah. So the way I think about it is over time, if I had to make a prediction, always risky, but if I had to make a prediction, I would say that AI used responsibly, and I highlight that word, that phrase, used responsibly, um, has the potential to supplement what we do, but not replace what we do. That's how I think about it. I'm talking about supplement, not replace. But it's got to be used very carefully, very cautiously, used responsibly. And I think that's the heavy lift, figuring out what's ethically appropriate, what's clinically appropriate, what's legally appropriate. Again, if you're in Illinois and Nevada, I'm staying away from this stuff for therapeutic purposes. You're not allowed to use it. But if you're in Texas at this moment, you are allowed to use it. So that's my current thinking. I don't think it's going to put us out of business. So,
Thank you so
all right.
much just for reassuring everyone.
Well, again, it's just my opinion. I mean, I can't guarantee anything. I don't have a magic wand.
Yeah,
I wish I could order one of those
that's fine.
things online, but I don't know how to do that. So, as I mentioned before, we took a few comments, questions. In my opinion, at this moment, um, these are the core ethical issues. I hope you see that up there on the screen again. I hope the PowerPoint's back up there. And then the question is, okay, given all this, what do we do to try to enhance the likelihood that practitioners are using AI responsibly if they're using it? Again, some of you might decide you don't want to have anything to do with this. And that also that our clients are using AI responsibly. So, my opinion, based upon what I see at this moment in time, that we need to look through three lenses. First, ethical standards. So whether you're a mental health counselor, psychologist, psychiatrist, marriage and family therapist, social worker, whatever you are, you're held to codes of ethics, right? That are pertinent to your profession. Social work has one primary code of ethics. Psychology has one primary code of ethics. Marriage and family therapy, one primary code of ethics. For reasons I don't want to get into, mental health counseling has three of them. There are three different codes, and different states recognize one or more of those codes. It's complicated. But the reality is, these codes of ethics evolve, right? There are issues we're dealing with now that codes of ethics didn't need to address 10, 20, 30 years ago. As I mentioned in social work, I chaired the task force that wrote the code. And most of that was drafted in the 1990s before any of this stuff was available. So we've had to update periodically. And as I said earlier, just yesterday, I was conferring with a colleague at the National Association of Social Workers about some AI specific ethical standards that may need to be in the code. A lot of stuff on technology, but not AI specifically. That's one lens. And we have to keep up with these things. As someone who spends a lot of time in courtrooms and licensing board hearing rooms, I sometimes hear practitioners testify under oath about the ethical standards in their profession. And they're talking about the ethical standards that existed when they graduated from their graduate program. But the code may have been updated once, twice, three times since then. Well, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what was in the code when you graduated. What matters legally is what's in the code at the time of the situation that's being addressed in that courtroom. That's what matters, or that licensing board hearing room. We're obligated to keep up with this stuff. It's not fun. It's time consuming, but we have to. I trust you would agree. Second, what in the trade we call ethics informed practice standards. So, what do I mean by that? So, if you take a look at national associations in behavioral health, AMFT, NASW, APA, ACA counseling, periodically those national organizations appoint task forces. The job of the task force is to come up with best practices regarding whatever the issue is. Helping people who struggle with addictions, working in schools, working with veterans, lots and lots and lots of specific best practice standards drafted by those task forces. And those become evidence, sometimes in litigation. Well, the behavioral professions have been developing ethics-informed practice standards pertaining to the use of technology, and now including artificial intelligence. So these are not codes of ethics, these are not laws, but courts of law, licensing boards recognize as indicators of prominent standards these ethics-informed practice standards. They get introduced as evidence in some of these cases. The third lens is the legal lens, regulatory standards. So most of you, I suspect, maybe not all of you, but most of you are licensed practitioners. That may be a major reason why you're here today, because you need your CEU credits. I get that. And as a licensed practitioner in whatever behavioral profession you're attached to, there are laws, statutes, legislative branch. They typically include some legal guidelines for licensed behavioral practitioners. But regulations, regulatory law, the executive branch of government, that's where most of the details typically are. And licensing boards are obligated to ensure that the public is protected by practitioners who adhere to those regulatory standards. It's a law. This is called regulatory law. It's law. It's not statutory law. It's regulatory law, but it's law. And regulations are changing. In a number of states, not all states, but in a number of states, those regulations have been revised under what's called the Administrative Procedures Act to include guidelines pertaining to broadly the use of technology to provide services to clients remotely, to interact with them on online social networking, stuff that was not in those regulations when they were first created decades ago. And now, most recently, regarding the use of artificial intelligence, it is law. So if any of you work in Illinois or Nevada, pay attention, because those regulations, in my opinion, are going to change. Because the governors in those states signed legislation banning, prohibiting the use of AI for therapeutic purposes. And that will end up being incorporated into revised regulations. So those are the three lenses that I think we need to look through as we seek guidance regarding the use of AI. Ethical standards, code of ethics, number one. Number two, ethics-informed practice standards. And number three, the law, regulatory standards. Examples. These are just examples. Now I'm a social worker, so I'm just going to use social work examples to keep it simple. But you can find comparable examples in the other behavioral health professions. The National Association of Social Workers Code of Ethics, again, I chaired the task force that wrote this thing. We've added a number of technology-related standards and now discussing adding content specifically related to AI, addressing the items in that bullet point list. And there's a screenshot of the Code of Ethics in social work. And of course, there are comparable screenshots for psychology, mental health counseling, marriage and family therapy, and so forth. The second lens, practice standards. So several years ago, I was asked to chair a different task force that was jointly sponsored by 4 major national organizations. This is social work, but again, you can find comparable examples in the other behavioral health professions. NASW, National Association of Social Workers, ASWB, Association of Social Work Boards, that's the umbrella group of all the licensing and regulatory bodies in North America, not just the US, but Canada as well. CSWE, which is the Council on Social Work Education, that's the accreditation body, right? You don't want to go to a graduate school that's not accredited. That's a problem. CSWE handles all that. And CSWA, which in social work is the Clinical Social Work Association. Those 4 organizations co-sponsored a task force that spent a year and a half developing state-of-the-art ethics-informed practice standards related to the use of technology. Here's a screenshot of the physical document, 61 pages long. 61 pages long. At our first meeting, I said to the group Thank you for being willing to serve on this thing, yada, yada, yada. And my recommendation is that we try to come up with a relatively short, succinct document to increase the likelihood that people will read it. Well, I flunked that one because by the time we were done doing all the research and the drafting and the redrafting and the redrafting, this thing is 61 pages long. I'm not happy about that, but we felt like we had to say all this stuff. And a lot of these standards are applicable to the use of AI. And then there's the third lens, regulatory standards. So every jurisdiction has regulatory law governing behavioral health practitioners. Several years ago, the Association of Social Work Boards, again, that's the umbrella group for all the licensing bodies in North America, including Canada and the US, appointed a different task force to develop so-called model regulatory standards for technology. And I was asked to chair this thing as well. So I've had the opportunity and great privilege to have sort of looked through all three lenses addressing these kinds of issues. Code of ethics lens, ethics-informed practice standards lens, and the regulatory lens. And this international group produced this document, Model Regulatory Standards for Technology and Social Work Practice. And when I say international, we had people from staff, members of the committee from Wales and Scotland and Ireland and Canada and all over the place. And I will tell you that jurisdictions around the world, not just North America, have been using these model regulatory standards to update their regulatory laws governing practitioners who use technology. And a lot of this stuff is applicable to the use of AI. Speaking of laws, I just want to show you an example of a prominent website, US AI Law Tracker. You can go to this website, you can look it up. This is just a screenshot. You can look it up. They keep track of laws enacted in the different states in the US pertaining to artificial intelligence. So if you look in this, you look up Nevada, look up Illinois, you'll see those dramatic changes in those two states. You'll also see legislation that's pending in other states. And this thing gets updated. It is a fast-moving train. So, ethics guardrails. My opinion, that if we take this challenge seriously, and it's a challenge that I would not describe as fun, I would describe it as important, necessary, time-consuming. I would say it should include a number of core elements if we're going to come up with ethics-informed policies related to the use of AI. And I'm not going to read this whole list, but the key points. I think we have to. If you're working in a human service organization, a behavioral health organization, we have to come up with ethics-based governing principles. Like, okay, are we going to use AI? Why are we going to use it? How are we going to use it? Ethics-based. If I were in charge, I would probably have a digital ethics steering committee, people who are interested in doing this stuff. I'm probably going to come up with some focus groups to give some feedback on the AI tools we're thinking about using, whether they're for documentation purposes or providing people with emotional support, surveillance, whatever it is. I'm going to subject the algorithms to peer review. It's kind of the gold standard. I'm going to conduct some simulations before we are ready for prime time. I am going to keep track of every step we take to try to do this responsibly. I'm going to be sure that anybody on my staff, I realize some of you are in private practice, so you don't have a staff. It's like you, unless you're like head of a clinical private practice group. But I'm saying nobody's using this stuff. Nobody's using this stuff before we provide rigorous training. I think it's irresponsible to use this stuff without proper education and training, and it's a major legal risk if we encourage the use of any of this without proper training. Boy, the lawyer on the other side of the case who gets a practitioner or an administrator to admit under oath that they were using these tools without providing training, potential disaster in that courtroom. I'm going to pay close attention to what I called algorithmic bias because we know it's a real thing. So I want you to know there are a fair number of people out there in the world who are paying attention to these issues and trying to come up with these ethics-informed best practices. Here are three major examples. A lot of this stuff's happening internationally. So first example, you've all heard of UNESCO. You may not remember exactly what the acronym stands for, United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. UNESCO, bless its little heart, has created what's called the Global AI Ethics and Governance Observatory. Now, that's a mouthful, but they've done some great, great, great work at UNESCO to develop ethics-informed guidelines for the responsible use of AI. Now, UNESCO is not focused on behavioral health. They're thinking about AI broadly in every domain: healthcare, government, education, whatever. And if you go to their website, which, by the way, is this is just a screenshot of their website, you can go down the rabbit hole and you can spend hours, I mean hours, exploring the guidance they've developed for the ethical use of AI. And even though they don't focus primarily on behavioral health, I believe, having looked at this stuff, that there's a lot embedded in UNESCO's work that we can use in behavioral health. Here's a second example. This organization that my guess is most of you have never heard of, called the iOS, or because it's international, sometimes it gets translated into ISO, but whatever. In English, International Organization for Standardization. What is that? It's been around a long, long, long time. It is not focused on behavioral health primarily. The goal of this organization, international, is to try to enhance consistency across countries in the world of commerce and health and education, right? Standardization. The word is in the title. And they have developed an initiative focused on artificial intelligence to try to enhance the likelihood that the use of AI in whatever domain is fair and transparent and doesn't cause harm and is appropriately accountable and ensures privacy to the greatest extent possible and includes people who are affected by AI, right? I know in this day and age, it can be a little risky to talk about DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, but I can tell you as a social worker, I'm using the term and I'm paying attention to those issues because I think they are important. I understand it's complicated politically, but that's my opinion. And I think that pertains to the development of artificial intelligence guidelines, that we've got to include people who are likely to be affected by this, and that means diversity and equity and inclusion. So iOS, I'll show you their website, which the international website says ISO, but it's the same outfit. And this is just a screenshot of their project on artificial intelligence. And as it says, the potential benefits and risks of AI are formidable for society as well as for companies. So they do a lot of work in commerce, companies, business. Standards that enhance transparency, data quality, system reliability are a way to mitigate risks and maximize rewards, incorporating desired societal and ethical outcomes based on comprehensive stakeholder inputs. They can help bridge gaps in regulation. Okay, so that's a mouthful, and it's kind of formal. But I applaud the iOS or ISO, depending upon what language you're speaking. I applaud them for their efforts that I think we in behavioral healthcare can draw on. Okay, so those are two international examples. But now let me focus on the US. I applaud the state of Utah. Utah, you might be asking? Utah has taken the lead in the development of ethics-informed guidelines for behavioral health. The Utah legislature, ready for this? Surprises a lot of people, It surprised me when I first heard about it. The Utah legislature created a new government agency with the title of Utah Office of Artificial Intelligence Policy. Whoever could have imagined? That's the last bullet point on this list. Whoever could have imagined a state agency with a title like Utah Office of Artificial Intelligence Policy? So, how do I know about this? A number of months ago, I got a phone call. I didn't know anything about this. And the caller introduced himself. He said, "Hi, I'm Zach Boyd, and I am the relatively new executive director of this new agency in Utah." Turns out Zach Boyd is a PhD mathematician who's on loan from Brigham Young University to head up this, at that point, new agency. And he explained this to me, that in Utah, there's now a new state agency whose job is to develop state-of-the-art ethics-based guidelines for the use of artificial intelligence in all the sectors of the Utah economy, government, and so forth. And he shocked me, Dr. Boyd did. He shocked me when he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but we're going to have to do this for healthcare in Utah, for education, for commerce, and blah, 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 agriculture. Kind of think about the cabinet offices. He said, but our first project is behavioral health. I almost fell off my chair because I'm so used to us being like at the bottom of the list or somewhere close to the bottom of the list. And he said, no, we're starting with behavioral health because it is so important. So I said, wow. And then he said, I'm thinking, like, why are you calling me? And he said, well, I and my staff, we've done our research. We found you've done a lot of writing on this. And we'd like to know if we can bring you in as a consultant and run some of the stuff by you. And I said, A, I'm really impressed that you're doing this. And B, assuming I can find the time, sure, I'll do that. And folks, look it up. I encourage, if you have any interest in this topic, and I realize for some of you, we're going to be done in, a little less than an hour, and you might be thinking, I'm done with this. End of story. Fine. But if you are at all interested in ethics-informed best practices, specifically focused on behavioral health and the use of AI, I commend this document to you. So this is just a screenshot of the cover. Title: Best Practices for the Use of Artificial Intelligence by Mental Health Therapists, unquote. And came out about a year ago, a little less. And notice at the top, it is co-sponsored by the Utah Office of Artificial Intelligence Policy, this relatively new state agency. I believe the first state to do this. And on the right, it says the Utah Division of Professional Licensing. My point being that the state agency, and every state has one of these things, different names, but every state has one. It's the state agency that oversees licensed practitioners. They issue licenses, they handle licensing board complaints, all that stuff. That's what the Division of Professional Licensing does. And so they were also involved. And this document, it is not short. It is pretty darn long. And they did a great job. Now, my fingerprints are on this a little bit, but they did the heavy lifting. I think they did a great job. And it's a great resource, and it's free, and it's publicly available. And so if any of you are involved in developing ethics-informed protocols pertaining to behavioral healthcare and the use of AI, I think it is a great, great resource. As I said, national associations, organizations in behavioral healthcare are like paying close attention to this. So here's an example. This is a screenshot of the American Psychological Association advisory on AI. Quote, APA Health Advisory on the use of generative AI chatbots and wellness applications for mental health, unquote. So when I talked about the three lenses, and I said one of the lenses is ethics-informed practice standards. We've done it in social work. We're still doing it. APA, this is their example, and there are others. I just wanted to show you those examples. Okay, let's get real practical here. So there may be some of you who are using AI to generate clinical notes. Or maybe some of you are thinking about using AI to generate clinical notes. I recognize some of you are like, nah, not doing it. Okay, fine. But if you are doing it, or you're thinking about doing it, this is the language I recommend. And I just want to add, I said it before, but I have to say it again. I'm not an attorney. You may need to run this kind of language if you find the language appealing by an attorney in your jurisdiction to be sure that this language satisfies the law in your jurisdiction regarding consent to treat, because state laws differ. But this is my recommendation. Quote, I sometimes use a HIPAA-compliant AI documentation tool to help draft my progress notes. If used, the tool processes audio from our session to create a draft that I review, edit, and finalize. And by the way, let me just add, I hope that's true, that anybody using this stuff really reviews these AI-generated notes, edits them as needed, and so forth. The tool's vendor is bound by a business associate agreement. As I trust you know, that's a HIPAA term, and may not use your information for other purposes. You can opt out at any time. I will then complete notes without AI assistance, period, unquote. That's my recommendation, subject to, getting the good housekeeping seal of approval in your state. And if I'm using this technology, I would put at the end of every single note, you don't have to type this. You can actually build this into your template. But I recommend language like this. Quote, this note was drafted with the assistance of an AI documentation tool. I reviewed the content in full, edited the content to ensure accuracy, and accept professional responsibility for the accuracy of the clinical information assessments and plans, period, unquote. I recommend language like that. To me, this is very good risk management. Now, earlier today, I said that even if you are a clinician who does not want to endorse the use of AI to help clients, you're not going to introduce them to things like WISA and EarKick and Therabot and all those, EB. Even if you're not going to do this stuff, my recommendation is to revise your consent to treat protocols to ensure that you are bringing this up when you begin working with a client. And I've put together this language. Now, there's a lot on here. You may have to put on your magnifying glasses to see it, but I'll go over the key points. So I recommend, again, subject to the good housekeeping seal of approval to be sure it's compliant with the law in your state, I recommend covering 5 major points with clients, even if, I'm going to say it one more time, even if you are not endorsing the use of AI, but you know that some of your clients might be using it. P.S., they might be using it and not telling you they're using it. Quote, some clients may choose to use artificial intelligence-based platforms, applications, or chatbots that are designed to provide mental health or psychotherapy-related information or support. Please be advised of the following, and I say there are 5 major points to make. These AI tools are not a substitute for professional psychotherapy or emergency services. Some AI tools are designed to simulate human interaction in a way that can confuse users. They are not capable of assessing your individual circumstances, ensuring confidentiality, or providing personalized clinical care. AI tools may provide inaccurate, incomplete, or inappropriate information. They may provide advice that contradicts or conflicts with my treatment, cause confusion, and be counterproductive. Point number 2, confidentiality and privacy risks. Information you share with AI platforms may not be protected by federal or state confidentiality laws, including HIPAA. P.S., right? Not to mention the fact that in Illinois and Nevada, you're not allowed to use it anyway. Your personal health information could be stored, used, or shared by the company that operates the AI system. Point number 3, misdiagnosis or harm. AI platforms may generate advice or interpretations that are incorrect or misleading. I am not responsible for any outcomes, decisions, or consequences that result from your use of such platforms. You can tell this is kind of lawyerly language, but that's the world I live in. Point number 4, again, think Nevada, Illinois. Legal prohibition and regulation. Use of AI tools for therapeutic purposes may be prohibited or regulated by state and federal laws, particularly involving minors. And then, as you would expect, because we're all used to this challenge, dealing with emergencies and crises. If you're experiencing a mental health crisis, you know where this is going, because most of you have this on your outgoing voicemail message and in your written documents. Suicidal thoughts or feel unsafe, and I'm not going to read that whole thing, but do what you would expect to recommend. And it says you may also contact me directly through the procedures outlined in this consent form, but in an emergency, always seek, all that, right? And then the last paragraph, I think, is absolutely key. By signing this consent form, you acknowledge that you understand the potential risks of using AI-based mental health platforms, and such use is entirely voluntary and independent of the professional services I provide. I encourage you to inform me if you are considering using or are using an AI tool for support so we can discuss the potential benefits and risks. So, another analogy. All of you, or most of you, I suspect, have a primary care physician, right? In this day and age, good luck finding one if yours retires or moves somewhere because there's a shortage. But anyway, I hope you all have a primary care physician. And, it's customary to have the annual visit, the annual physical. Even if you're not having an acute or chronic problem, let's get together at least once a year and go over how things are going. And I trust that these physicians, especially primary care, often ask, so, I know the medications I have prescribed to you, but please list for me on this piece of paper or this screen any other medications you're taking, prescribed by other physicians or over-the-counter medications and/or things like, medical marijuana, edibles, that kind of thing. So I think we're all used to these questions. And I would argue that any physician in 2026 who does not ask that question exposes herself, himself, themselves to legal risk. That it would be malpractice in this day and age to not ask a patient about what medications they may be using that physician did not prescribe, so they can have a constructive conversation about possible drug interactions, risks, and so forth. I think any physician who fails to do that has legal exposure, as lawyers would say. And I think it's a great analogy that in behavioral health care, the equivalent of those other medications is AI, where some of our clients, not the majority, but I think the number is increasing, are using AI without our advice, without our recommendation. They may be doing it at 2:37 a.m., or maybe they're doing it at 2:37 in the afternoon. Who knows? And I think the standards have changed and that we are obligated to include in our consent decree protocols this information. You may disagree, but my thinking has evolved on this, and I've consulted with lawyers on this, and I think that's where we are. So I recommend revising your consent decree protocols if they don't include this content. Again, even if you're not recommending or endorsing the use of AI. All right. AI ethical impact statements. So this is a thing. And I know it sounds rather formal. Now, some of you are in private practice, I imagine, and others of you work in behavioral health organizations. This is especially for people working in behavioral health or healthcare organizations, human services. It's become the standard, I believe, to develop what we call an AI ethical impact statement. I think it can be a very helpful document. Again, not fun. It's time consuming. It's hard work. But my position is it's absolutely necessary. in this day and age. And a comprehensive AI ethical impact statement that I've written about, it's in the literature, includes a number of key elements. I'm not going to read all this. I'd probably put you to sleep if I did that. But let me summarize key points. I'd start off with, okay, in this organization, behavioral health, human services, social services, whatever, we're planning to use AI in the following ways for the following purposes. And here are the steps we're going to take to try to protect our clients, to try to prevent harm. And I'd lay all those out. That's pretty much what's in that second bullet point. Is AI really important? Is it necessary? Or is it gratuitous, meaning we don't really need to do that, in which case I'd probably avoid it? Do we think there's a compelling reason to be using it for any of the purposes that I described earlier? Third bullet point, and the ethical impact statement would lay out like who's involved in overseeing this whole thing. And why are they on this committee or task force or whatever you want to call it? And is it sufficiently diverse? Again, I know politically these days, this is a bit of a third rail, diversity, equity, inclusion, but I think it's absolutely necessary. To be sure, there's adequate representation, gender, age, race, color, descent, language, religion, national origin, ethnic origin, all that stuff. Very important, including sexual orientation, gender expression. And I want that to represent the client or patient population. Fourth bullet point, multi-stakeholder governance. Again, it's jargon. I get that. But who's going to be affected by these AI tools? And I want them involved. I want them to give feedback as members of focus groups or whatever. That's a bit different from the adequate representation of demographics. Safety and security. I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, because of the potential access by third parties that's not appropriate or authorized. We know that databases can be manipulated, corrupted. What are we doing? I put this in the ethical impact statement. The steps we're taking to try to minimize this likelihood. Can we prevent it 100%? Nah, I don't think so. But can we take steps to try to really reduce the likelihood of a problem? Cyber threats, all that, with AI generated info, you bet. And a lot of places are doing it, but I would include that detail in this ethical impact statement. Sort of going back to the DEI issue, right? I want to be sure to test these algorithms, not only involve people from different diverse groups in the development of these, but I also want to like try these things out. We call it beta testing. You've probably heard that term. To be sure that we're not discriminating, algorithmic bias, all that kind of thing. The last bullet point on this slide, sustainability. So this is complicated. At least it is for me. You probably know, if you've been reading any of the publicity around AI, any adequate news coverage, that sustainability is a major issue. AI is, I think it's fair to say, an energy hog. It's an energy hog. You've probably read about efforts on the part of some companies to build these massive facilities in a number of states to handle all the demand for AI. Well, that has environmental implications, right? Raw material extraction, processing of computer chips, transportation, electricity, water is a huge, huge issue because of the need to keep these computer installations cool. I mean, we're talking enormous energy costs. And I don't mean just money. That's part of it, of course, but also just the impact on the environment. And I will tell you that, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I mean, I do use AI, but I'm always thinking about the environmental impact. So I try to minimize my use to try to be sensitive to that. Doesn't mean I've sworn it off. I guess there are some people who've sworn it off. I haven't. But I do want to be sensitive to and aware of environmental impact as best I can. Continued with regard to ethical impact statements. 4 additional points. If I were developing one of these for my organization, it would include a lot of commentary on the steps we're taking to try to prevent inappropriate access to AI generated information, data protection, all that sort of thing. Human oversight and determination. Earlier, I mentioned the phrase escalation protocols, more AI jargon. Sorry about that. But if I'm going to use it, or if I think clients are going to use some of these things to get help to cope with the challenges in their lives, I want to be sure there is a human in the loop. That's a phrase we often use, human in the loop, that we're not just delegating suicide risk assessment, suicide safety plans, and all that to AI. I don't want to do that. If I'm going to use AI, I want to be sure there are these so-called escalation protocols embedded in the platform so that if somebody's in crisis, there's a way to try to connect them with a human being as quickly as is humanly possible for obvious reasons. And I've tried out some of these AI platforms pretending to be a client. I've actually put in there some fake, like suicidal ideation, suicidal thinking. And some of them I think are really good at trying to connect the user with a human being. And some of them, I think, fail miserably. Scary, 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 scary. You'll see at the end of that bullet point, I say, are there mechanisms in place for a human entity to override decisions made by the AI system? Then the third bullet point on this slide, transparency, explainability, accountability, responsibility. That goes back to all the consent procedures. Are we being truly transparent? Are we explaining this stuff in sufficient detail? Potential benefits and potential risks. And then finally, awareness and literacy. By now, you know, if you didn't know before today, that there is so much jargon when you talk about AI. And if I am coming up with consent to tree protocols, I'm going to avoid this jargon as best I can because not all clients understand this jargon. And I don't mean to disparage their intelligence. It's just like most people don't talk this way. But natural language processing and large language models and algorithmic I mean, I'm not going to use that terminology. I want to use plain language to enhance the likelihood that people will actually understand this stuff. Okay, so those are AI ethical impact statements. We've got about a half hour. And again, I want to leave time for Bonnie to share some additional questions and comments before we wrap things up at the top of the hour. So let me go back to what I said earlier about how I spend a great deal of my professional time serving as what the courts call an expert witness in litigation and licensing board cases. And this is the reality that I know. In every one of those cases, and I hesitate to say something that emphatically, but I'm saying it because I believe it's true. And I think it's warranted. In every one of those cases, that's not hyperbole, that's not an exaggeration. Here's what happens. If I'm brought in as the expert witness, the lawyers will share with me every single document and what they call ESI, not CSI, that's a TV show, ESI, which stands for electronically stored information. ESI is now referenced explicitly in both federal and state rules of civil procedure. So what are those? If it's a federal court case, lawyers have to comply with a whole bunch of rules in what's called the federal rules of civil procedure. With regard to every step of the litigation, you're allowed to do this, you're allowed to do that, you can file this, you can file that, you can subpoena this, you can subpoena, but here's the stuff you're not supposed to do. Same thing at the state level. If it's a state court case, they have to follow the state rules of civil procedure. Let me give you an example. If you have a client who files in federal court, the lawyers have to follow what's called Rule 34. That's literally the number of the rule. Rule 34, which has been revised over time. It's been around for decades and decades and decades. And it provides guidance to lawyers about subpoenas, particularly what's called a subpoena ducis tecum. That's Latin D-U-C-E-S, new word T-E-C-U-M. That's what lawyers issue. Some of you have probably gotten those. If your client's involved in a legal proceeding, such as a child custody dispute or termination of parental rights, or a criminal court case or workers' comp case or what have you, sometimes your records get subpoenaed. That's called a subpoena ducis tecum. And Rule 34 has been updated. It used to reference subpoenaing your written records, sometimes your checkbook, if there's a question about financial transactions, your calendar, your schedule, that might be evidence that you met with so-and-so on such and such a date. What lawyers call documents and tangible things. That's a lawyer phrase, tangible things. Well, Rule 34, and the same thing has happened at the state level, has been revised. And now there's an additional phrase there, ESI, electronically stored information. When those rules were established, there was no electronically stored information. People used pen, paper, typewriters. But now lawyers know that we sometimes have relevant text messages, email messages, online social networking posts, entries in electronic health and medical record. They know this stuff exists, and they want it if it's relevant to the case. So if you have AI-generated notes in the clinical record, expect those to be subpoenaed if there's a legal proceeding. And the lawyers are going to pore over every word. I mean, a good lawyer, there may be some exceptions out there, but in my experience, a competent lawyer looks at every single word, phrase, sentence, paragraph. And if it's defense counsel, they're looking for any evidence in those records, those documents, tangible things, electronically stored information with AI-generated details that can be helpful. And they'll introduce that as evidence of competent decision-making, competent consultation, whatever. But if it's opposing counsel who introduces that stuff as evidence, and they'll project it on the large LED screen in the courtroom using very fancy software that can do all kinds of things to increase the font size and highlight things with electronic yellow and red arrows and all kinds of stuff. If it's opposing counsel, as I said earlier today, they're only doing it for one reason, because they have found problems in that documentation that they want to use to their advantage. And if it's AI-generated information, like those AI-generated clinical notes, they're looking for errors. They're looking for false narratives. They're looking for so-called hallucinations. They're looking for omissions. They're looking for anything they can find to challenge the practitioner's testimony. Well, every time I get all these records, these documents, these so-called tangible things, all the ESI, every text message, email message, online post, and AI-generated records, once I'm done with my review, every single time, the lawyer will ask me the following question, or some version of it. And it goes like this. So, Dr. Reamer, now that you've had an opportunity to review all the evidence in this matter, do you believe the fill in the blank, marriage and family therapist, counselor, psychologist, social worker, met the standard of care? They always use that phrase, standard of care, or fell below it. And the reason they use that phrase, standard of care, is that it is the principal measuring rod in litigation. And it's been around since the 1800s. I kid you not. It's been around since the 1800s. You can look it up. If any of you here today are from the state of Maine, this all started especially with a famous case that every law school student that I know of learns about in law school called Coombs versus Bede. Coombs versus Bede. You can look it up. And Coombs versus Bede basically introduced this concept into U.S. law in the late 1800s. That's how old this thing is. And Coombs versus Bede, interestingly, had nothing to do with behavioral health care in the late 1800s. This case goes to the Supreme Court. They're not thinking about us. The term behavioral health care didn't even exist. The field of marriage and family therapy didn't exist in the 1800s. Mental health counseling, as we know it today, didn't exist. Social work, psychiatry, psychology, those were emerging in the late 1800s. But here's what the court said in Coombs versus Bede, which, by the way, interestingly, involved a dispute between an architect and the architect's client. This sounds like the beginning of a joke. It's not a joke. This case goes to the Supreme Court. A family, the Bede family, hired an architect, Coombs, to design plans for them to build a house in Lewiston, Maine. Turns out the family, primarily Clarence, I think, if you read the record, was not happy with the architect's work. Thought it was not consistent with what they asked for. If the family followed the plans, it'd be over budget. So they had a dispute. And the family, Clarence, I think, primarily, refused to pay the architect's bill. And the architect said, in effect, I did what architects are supposed to do. You can build this house within budget. So they have a fee dispute. These things happen. This case goes to the Supreme Court. And the question before the court had less to do with the standards in architecture per se, but the standards in every profession. So if you read the Supreme Court opinion, basically what it says is, regardless of the profession, this is the late 1800s, regardless of the profession, the measuring rod, whether it involves a doctor, a dentist, an architect, an engineer, a psychologist, it doesn't matter. The measuring rod is what a reasonable and prudent professional with the same or similar training should have done under the same or similar circumstances. This sentence has 3 clauses in it, none of them named Santa. 3 clauses, none named Santa. Clause number 1, and think about this in terms of artificial intelligence. And I swear to you, in litigation today, if there is a dispute about whether a behavioral practitioner used AI in a way that was negligent and violated current standards of care, these are the 3 questions that are going to come up that I'm asked to opine about. That's a lawyer term, opine. Did the practitioner use AI in a way that was reasonable and prudent, meaning careful, cautious? That's in the concept of standard of care. So if a behavioral health practitioner is attracted to the shiny new toy, oh, AI, this is kind of cool, I'm going to start using it, but didn't get adequate training and education, that is substandard. The word prudent means they were careful, they were cautious. They didn't just start using the shiny new toy. That's clause number 1. Clause number 2, with the same or similar training. So today, here, we have people who, I suspect, come from very different behavioral health professions, maybe marriage and family counseling, and mental health counseling, and psychology, and social work, and maybe psychiatry, and psych nursing, and whatever. The courts want to know, clause number 2, what do educators in those professions teach about the use of AI? And it's starting to emerge in graduate school education. Probably not when you went, but if any program is responsible now, it's in there. And the third clause, how was the practitioner using AI? Was it to provide clinical support? Was it to generate content for grant applications? Was it to generate summaries of clinical encounters? What were the circumstances? And did they use it appropriately? So in some of my work, I distinguish between what I call the substantive and procedural standard of care. So substantive standard of care, the things we can all agree on, presumably, don't have sex with a client. That has nothing to do with AI. I don't know how you have sex with a client using AI. That would be a pretty neat trick. So I'm not worried about that. I guess there can be exchanges that have sexual content, but that's a different story. Don't falsify records. Okay, so those are easy substantive standards of care where we know that clinicians generally agree. Don't have sex with the client, don't falsify records. Reasonable and prudent practitioners wouldn't do that. Those are the easy cases. But then there's all the complex ethics stuff that I encounter in my career, where there are, in my opinion, reasonable differences of opinion among us with regard to things like self-disclosure to clients. Some of us are more comfortable with that than others. How we handle gifts and invitations. Some of us accept the gift, the invitation, some of us don't. Boundary issues. Disclosure of confidential information without client consent to third parties. Complex cases. I consulted on one this morning before we started this webinar involving a suicide risk, where people in the peer consultation group disagreed. These things happen. When to be vague in clinical notes, when not to be vague, given who might have access to those notes. And so what I argue, and I think it's relevant to this discussion of AI, is that given the complexity of artificial intelligence, given what I think is the lack of consensus in this moment about when it should be used, how it should be used, that there are reasonable differences of opinion, I do not think, my opinion, I do not think there is a crystal clear substantive standard of care, the way there is for some other things. I think at this moment in time, there is disagreement. There are reasonable differences of opinion. So here's the position I make, and I've made it in writing. I think there are 8 things we can do. Given the ambiguity about the use of AI, the difference of opinion about the use of AI, there are 8 things we can do if we are thinking about incorporating AI in our practices in any of the ways I described earlier. I would be getting some consultation from colleagues. If I have a supervisor, if you're in private practice, you probably don't have one. I'm going to talk to colleagues, supervisors, about possible use of AI, and I'm going to document those conversations. Because as lawyers tend to learn in law school, you've probably heard this, if it's not written, it did not happen. Now, that's not true, of course. I can think of all kinds of conversations I have that I don't document. Doesn't mean they didn't happen, but in behavioral health care, I go by that. If it's not written, it didn't happen, even though technically that's not true. But I'm documenting consultation and supervision around AI use. Number 2, I'm going to take a look at the current ethical standards that might be applicable to the use of AI, which are probably not the ethical standards that were in effect when most of us got our graduate degrees. And I'm going to document that I looked at those standards because it shows a good faith effort to handle this stuff responsibly. Number 3, I'm going to take a look at national practice standards related to the use of technology, related to the use of AI, and I'm going to document that I looked at that stuff. Number 4, I'm going to take a look at, or at least find out about relevant laws, right? So I told you about Illinois and Nevada, but if I'm in Mississippi, Montana, Missouri, Maryland, Michigan, or some other state that begins with an M or any other letter, I need to find out what the current status is of the law in my state. I need to find out if my licensing board has any regulations pertaining to the use of AI. If my agency, if you're not in private practice, has developed any guidelines regarding the use of AI, that's number 4, and I'm going to document that I did that. So if anybody questions my judgment, I can say, look, here it is. Number 5, relevant literature. If we were having this discussion 2 years ago, there wasn't much literature on the use of AI in behavioral health care. Now there is. Lawyers find this stuff in litigation. And if it's reputable literature, not self-published, they don't care about that, doesn't count. But if it's peer-reviewed professional literature, they're looking at it, and they might introduce it as evidence. I think I have a responsibility to read some of this stuff. Number 6, I've said it several times today, it may be a good idea to run some of these policies and protocols by an attorney in your state who knows something about defending behavioral health care practitioners and organizations and is learning something about AI to get their blessing and feedback. Not just their blessing, but also feedback. Some of you may work, number 7, in settings where there's an ethics committee. So if you're in private practice, you don't have one. But if you work in a hospital, you probably do. And some behavioral health organizations have developed ethics committees that are there for consultation. They're not going to tell you what to do, but for consultation. And it's good risk management to run some of these protocols by them. Their members may not agree, but that's okay. It shows a good faith effort to get the consultation. And then, as I've said multiple times today, the vital importance of good documentation regarding all these steps. Because I always think ahead to litigation. Not a pleasant way to live, but that's what I do for a living, in part. I always think ahead to litigation. I think ahead to licensing board hearings. And I know, this is not hyperbole, I know that much more often than not, the outcome of a lawsuit, the outcome of a licensing board complaint is determined by the quality of the documentation. I kid you not. I've seen it over and over and over again. Timely documentation that's thorough, carefully edited, carefully proofread, entered in a timely fashion, saves the day over and over again. But every coin I know has two sides. And the other side of that coin is when the documents I see entered into evidence, they were entered into the clinical record late, in violation of policy or standard of care. They were not carefully proofread. They were not carefully edited. There are errors, omissions, disaster. And I have a lot of examples I could share with you if we had the time. Let me just say a couple more things, and then we'll open it up before we conclude. If it's a lawsuit, lawyers have to prove 4 things. Let me apply it to AI. This has been around for decades and decades and decades. If you're using AI, you have a duty to use it responsibly. If there's an allegation of negligence, a lawyer on the plaintiff's side, the party bringing the suit, has to show dereliction or breach of the duty. That's kind of lawyer language. That the way AI was used didn't comply with standards of care. That's where standard of care comes in. And that it caused harm. That's the 3rd element. And the 4th element, what lawyers call proximate cause, an uninterrupted connection between the breach of the duty using AI, for example, and harm, injury. I showed you the litigation examples. People have died after they used AI or engaged in self-harming behavior and sued. This is what a standard negligence lawsuit looks like. If it's a licensing board complaint, unlike a lawsuit, the board does not have to have any evidence of harm. 0. In a lawsuit, you do. Licensing board case, you don't. All you need is evidence that the practitioner failed to comply with standards adopted by the board. So in Nevada and Illinois, for example, if the regulations say don't use it for therapeutic purposes, but somebody did anyway, either they didn't know about the law or they disregarded the law, and somebody files a board complaint, they don't need evidence of harm. They don't. All they need is evidence of failure to comply. And without getting into the legal stuff too specifically, lawyers will talk about different kinds of negligence, misfeasance, malfeasance, nonfeasance, acts of commission, acts of omission. It's complicated, takes too much time to get into. By the way, here's a screenshot of the Illinois law that prohibits the use of AI for therapeutic purposes. You can look it up. The 104th General Assembly basically says you can't use it. You know, most other states you still can, but not in Illinois, not in Nevada. And I'm going to skip some of this. I want to make one final point. Insurance. So I get involved in a lot of cases where clinicians get sued, they have licensing board complaints filed against them, and they do not have adequate malpractice coverage. I see it too often. If you're in private practice, you probably have your own coverage. Please double check to be sure it's adequate coverage. You might need to increase the limits if you haven't done that in a while. Make sure you have what's called cyber liability coverage, particularly if you're using AI. That's an add-on. But if you work for a behavioral health organization, a school district, a child welfare department, a hospital, it doesn't matter. I beg of you, my opinion, do not rely on your employer's malpractice coverage. There are 4 reasons why it may not be a good idea. There can be a conflict of interest if there's a lawsuit. The attorney who's retained is defending your employer, not you. I've been involved in cases where the judgment or the settlement, the verdict or the settlement exceeded the cap on the employer's policy. If, heaven forbid, there's a licensing board complaint associated with the use of I would never respond to that complaint on my own. I want an attorney who specializes in this kind of law to help me craft the response. It is so important. And they cost money. The employer is probably not going to pay for it. They usually don't. Their coverage is for lawsuits. But if you have your own policy, part of the coverage, in addition to lawsuits, is paying a lawyer to defend you in a licensing board complaint. And for those of you in an employment setting, this may not be the last job you'll ever have. You may move on in 3 months after you leave for another job, or you move out of state or whatever. You're named in a lawsuit associated with the use of AI where somebody died. Can you guarantee that your former employer will protect you? And there are different kinds of policies. I don't have time to get into it. And the last slide has a bunch of sources. If any of you want to know more about this, there it is. Or maybe you're struggling with insomnia, in which case reading all that stuff might be helpful as a sleep aid. Okay, Bonnie, what do you got?
Thank you so much, Dr. Reamer. This is very insightful information. We have a couple questions here. I know you mentioned the task force and some of the recommendations as far as what to talk about, but some of the questions was, from your experience, have professionals been involved in the ones who have been involved in developing AI platforms, been in these task forces or in these spaces?
So I can't give you a single answer that is uh, um, applicable to every one of these task forces. My experience. The task forces that I know about or have been associated with include a mix of people. There are those behavioral health practitioners who may not know a whole lot about AI, but they're really interested. They care about this stuff. They want to handle this responsibly. So they have a seat at the table, whether literally or figuratively. Then there are the task forces that have gone out of their way to include people who have been studying AI, who are thinking about this stuff, who can contribute that kind of expertise. Is that happening in every instance? Probably not. But I think there's some great examples out there where you have multiple perspectives at that table, including people who know an awful lot about AI, which is not all of us. Most of us don't have this kind of training. So it varies.
Thank you. Yes, we do have plenty of task force in very, very small areas, so it is
Mm-hmm.
important to be aware of. We can't count for all of them, but
Yep.
important to know about. Thank you.
Yep.
There's also been an increased dialogue around mental health professionals being viewed as non-professionals in some spaces. How does the rise of AI really maintain our integrity and value in our profession?
I'm not sure I have anything really wise to say about that. Hmm. Um, um, Again, I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I don't mean to be evasive here. What do you think the question's asking?
Yeah, so they're just asking as far as having this new label around non-professionals. Um, how
You're
does
talking about
AI,
like an AI chatbot that's a
yeah,
non-professional? I'm not
maybe
sure what that means, non-professional.
us utilizing AI kind of as intersecting with it being a conflict, kind of discrediting our profession and that non-professional
Oh,
title that
okay,
has been
okay.
around.
I think I get it. I get it. That there are all these AI platforms out there that assert that they can provide help to people who struggle in life, right? So some of them are designed for behavioral health purposes, and but they're not human beings. So in that sense, they're not professionals, as we tend to think about that term, professional, right? They're AI chatbots. Um, so I guess the only useful thing I have to say about this is basically to repeat what I said earlier, that one way to maintain our integrity, our professionalism, is to incorporate this in our discussions with clients at the beginning of our work with them. That language I shared earlier, right? That was that pretty detailed slide that says basically, so some people choose to use AI to get help. And if you're using it or you're thinking about using it, let's talk about it. And that language, if you go back to that language, it basically says these are not human beings. And they don't necessarily provide great advice in every instance. They can misdiagnose. So in other words, I guess what I'm saying is let's just be upfront with our clients about what AI can do and what it may not be able to do or may not be able to do well consistently. And I think that is a reflection of our efforts to be professional and to distinguish between AI tools that are not professionals, but might, as lawyers would say, hold themselves out to be behavioral health professionals. But they're not. They're chatbots or whatever. So I just think we have to acknowledge this in our consent to treat protocols. And I'm sorry if that's just repetitious, but that's the best I can do.
Yes, definitely. And just one last question here before I jump into the really great our link to RC, because I have noticed that you are on the board for reviewing licensure. So we did have a question on, has there been certain clinicians at loss of their license due to the use of AI?
Great question. I have not seen it yet. I predict it will happen. But I think this stuff is relatively new. And as a result, I'm not aware of instances where people have lost their licenses because of the ways in which they've used AI. But here's my prediction. I'll be quick because I know Bonnie's going to wrap things up here. So I showed you early in our discussion today examples, real life and death examples involving the link between AI and suicide, self-harming behavior. So there are lawsuits out there. Some people who file lawsuits also file licensing board complaints. They don't always, but I see them. We call them twofers, lawsuit and a licensing board complaint. If somebody also files a licensing board complaint, they're likely to allege that a practitioner's use of AI was unethical, did not comply with regulatory standards, and caused harm. Even though the licensing board does not need evidence of harm, they often assert that. And so I predict before long, we are going to see people who they may not lose their license. So licensing boards, give me 20 seconds. Licensing boards, it's not an either or. Revoke the license, don't revoke the license. They actually have a slide in there. I skipped over it because we didn't have the time. But licensing boards have lots of options. They can reprimand a clinician saying, look, we know this is new for you. You got to handle AI differently. Reprimand, slap on the wrist. Probation. We're putting you on probation. Go get more training on the use of AI. You have to go to this Agents of Change webinar on AI as part of the consent agreement. I swear to you, they do things like this. Or we're suspending your license. And during the suspension, you have to do ABC 1, 2, 3, and then you can apply for reinstatement after a year. I'm consulting on 3 cases right now where there was a year or 2-year suspension. These practitioners have to do a lot of work and then they can apply for reinstatement. I think some of this is going to happen as a result of AI. And then in the worst cases, they can revoke the license. So it's kind of a progression of sanctions.
I hope you enjoyed this continuing education course from Agents of Change. Want to earn your CE credits for this course? Visit agentsofchangetraining.com or the link in the description to purchase the course and take the post-test. If you're looking for more CEs, check out our unlimited plan. You will get unlimited access to 150 plus ASWB and NBCC approved continuing education courses for one low annual fee. We're always adding new courses. Did I mention we also have 5 free CE credits available too? Check it out at agentsofchangetraining.com.